It's been a tough day. Values and principles. It's all in the family. Welcome back to the Bob Davis Podcast YouTube channel. This is the place where I talk about my most recent audio podcasts. And the most recent audio podcast that I did is podcast 1149. It's about values and principles, and it talks about how they are rooted in our early childhood, in our families. The idea, the germ of the idea for this podcast and for this video came from a viewer here on YouTube who commented that he thought it would be a good idea for me to take the things that I've learned about the values of the Old West, in particular Jim Bridger and the Mountain Men, and talk about how they affect U.S. politics. No, I'm not going to do that because I don't talk about politics on this channel or in the podcasts. And this is the thing about YouTube is they tell you should ask for suggestions from viewers and then do what they tell you to do, which is sometimes the worst thing you could do. Now, it's a good suggestion. It's a great germ of an idea for a podcast, but you don't always have to do what the viewers tell you to do. But I do like the idea for a podcast. Now, I'll post a link to the audio podcast in the description box. The difference between the two is probably mostly detail, and I'll tell you why. So then I said, well, no, I'm not going to do that. And then he said, well, then tell me about, I had read this book about Jim Bridger, and I talked about it in a couple of podcasts. Tell me about how you've adopted or adapted the values of Jim Bridger, the Mountain Man, and I said, well, I don't really operate under anyone else's principles. I operate under my own principles. Values are a different story. Values can come from lots of different sources: reading, experience, work experience, and so on. But principles really are formulated from our families in the early stages of our development. They aren't something that you adapt or adopt from someone else. So to give you some background, again, been reading, really listening to audiobooks about the Old West, an exhaustive study of the West from about 1806, well, really the 1760s, and the development of the Near West, what I would call the Near West, what they used to call the frontier, which is Ohio, Illinois, West Virginia, and so on, what became West Virginia, and so on, Tennessee, all the way out to the 1920s and the end of the western frontier and the actual full development of the lower 48. The last state to come into the lower 48, I believe, was Arizona, and that would have been around 1914, 1918. I don't remember. So I think it's 1914, or 1912, actually. But anyway, that's sort of the history of what I've been reading. And I thought, well, I'll tell you what I can do. I can talk about principles and where they come from, and I can tell stories from my childhood and my family. Now, I'm not going to tell a bunch of stories in the video because I try to keep these videos relatively short and just do a review of the content. But what's cool about doing the video after I do a podcast is there's always some perspective when you do an audio podcast. And the perspective changes some of the ideas that you had about the podcast. So being able to do a video after a podcast is great because it gives me some time to do really new content based on the podcast, which was based on this viewer's question. And the only way to really determine principles, and here's why I told stories about my family going back about 4 generations, is because we develop those principles early in life. And if you're going to get people to think about their early life, the best way to do that is to tell stories about your own family, because people listen and they follow along, and it spurs thinking about, well, how did I grow up, and what were my values and my principles, and what were my parents' values and principles. We don't adopt or adapt all of our family's principles. Some of them you don't want to adapt, depending on the people in your family and what they've done and how they've acted. Some of them are so deeply ingrained, later in life we find ourselves acting out in ways that we don't understand because it comes from this early childhood development. So what I tried to do was talk about my family's upbringing and my great-grandfather and my grandfather and my father and me. in terms of principles and values, and they were all different. My grandfather and his father were coal miners. My grandfather worked in the coal mines until he was 8, so he worked in the coal mines in south central Ohio and Appalachia when he was a little boy, and his brothers got together and said, we're getting him out of the mines. We are not going to have another relative basically spend their life in the mines and literally die early. So my grandfather had an 8th grade education. He was a great salesperson, and he grew up in this mining town. And it was a tough town. I'm not going to tell you where it is. There's a video on the YouTube channel about that town. It's considerably different than what it was back in the day, but it was a full-on, full-bore mining town at the turn of the 20th century. And the men wore guns. They didn't wear guns to make statements about the Second Amendment or to prove that they were tough or anything else. They wore guns because they had to, because it was a very rough town. My grandfather, as a salesperson, could tell a humdinger of a story, and he told a lot of stories. One of the stories he told was about I guess we called him Grandpa Fierce, but I don't know if he was a grandpa. I think it was my grandfather's uncle, so he would be my great uncle. And Grandpa Fierce, as we called him, loved to play poker. And the story I told was that my grandfather was a phenomenal poker player. And he learned to play poker because he would devil my great uncle Fierce, Grandpa Fierce, to take him with him when he would get into these games at the local bars in town. And so my grandfather would go up into the rafters over the table, and he would watch. And because he could see everybody's hand, he really developed an understanding of poker, and he could also see, their tells and the things that they were doing to sort of bluff and so on in the game. Well, one night, Grandpa Fierce called my grandfather down and said, this guy's cheating me, go home and get my gun. So my grandfather went home and got Grandpa Fierce's gun and gave it to him, and Grandpa Fierce shot the guy and killed him. And then he said, and now I have to leave. And so Grandpa Fierce, Uncle Fierce, whatever he was, because we don't know, I don't know, my dad did, but I don't know what the hell he was. We have a picture of Grandpa, we call them Grandma and Grandpa Fierce. And so I think that's where the Grandpa Fierce comes from. He was a great uncle. And he left and went out to South Dakota for a number of years. And he came back, I want to say he came back in the 1950s and resumed his life in this mining town. And everyone had forgotten that he'd killed this guy. My grandfather was such a good poker player, he could go, if my grandmother needed something, washing machine, whatever, he would go get in a poker game and win enough money to get that washing machine. So he had that skill. And with an 8th grade education, he became a salesperson. He also owned a couple of little stores in the region around this town. And my dad worked for him. My grandfather was on the road a lot. And my dad worked for him as a kid, and my grandmother ran the store. And my dad, one of his jobs was to take this old Model T pickup truck, if you could call it that, and put groceries in it, excuse me, and deliver them. And one of the people that he delivered groceries to was what he called an old hermit. And this was a guy that lived up in the hills, and my dad would deliver to him a case of dog food once a month. And he asked my grandpa, why does this guy only want dog food? We've got other things here in the store. And my grandpa said, because that's what he eats. And my dad was so taken aback, and he was like, you got to be kidding me. And he goes, no, this is what he doesn't have enough money for regular groceries. So we send him a case of dog food, and if he doesn't catch a squirrel or a rabbit or whatever up there, he eats the dog food. True story. And I didn't believe. My grandfather told me that I didn't believe it, and I asked my dad about it, and that's when he said, well, yeah, no, that one's true. He used to tell me, you got to be careful with Grandpa because he likes to tell stories. But that one was true. And there were many others. He told, my grandfather came from a fairly big family. His mother was a big woman and not very nice. She wore a thimble on her middle finger, And in those days, the thimbles were made of iron. You couldn't get an aluminum you couldn't get an aluminum. There she is. You couldn't get an aluminum thimble. So she wore these iron thimbles, and she would whack kids on the head right over the top of their head with this thimble if they got close enough to her. My dad and my uncle were terrified of her. So that was her. And then my great-grandfather was a kind of a thin guy, and he used to tell my grandpa one of his principles was get up from the table a little bit hungry. And my grandfather used to talk about that all the time. My grandfather also used to tell me this story. This is by way of principles, because he didn't impart too many principles to me. I mean, work hard, you got to put the work in, and you got to be smart, and you got to get an education, all those things. But one of the stories he told was, you're on a road in the middle of the night. It's a back road, because he was a traveling salesman, and it's storming, and you come upon this oil light. They used to put these oil lights. They were like they looked like cherries. They were you put diesel or you put diesel fuel in them, and then you lit them, and they would light the sawhorse. So as you're driving down the road, that was how you knew that there was a sawhorse up ahead and there might be a pothole or something back in the day. Later they put those yellow blinking things on top of them, and now we just light those areas so effectively that you can see them. Plus the lights on cars are so bright it's hard to believe. But his story was, you came upon this oil lamp and a bunch of sawhorses up, and you rolled the window down, and the cop came, and he said, the road is out up ahead. And my grandfather would say, and I'd say, well, can I get through? And he would say, well, if you do the right thing and you're careful and you go slow, you'll probably be okay. And that was one of his little stories that he told to impart certain values to me. My dad's values were, he did not talk a lot. My grandfather was very gregarious and ruthless, and my father, I think, was really affected by that. So my dad didn't have much to say. But he did say actions speak louder than words. That was one of his chief values. And it was true that, he didn't say much, but when he talked, you better listen. And hard work, honesty, and integrity, always. And he used to tell me that all the time. And loyalty was important to him. So he worked the same job for years and years and years. Now, my dad was a scientist, and his heroes were Madame Curie and Isaac Newton. And he loved the lab. He loved science. He loved learning. So he was very much of a realist. You'd said something that was apocryphal or fantastical, and he would laugh and say, what's the proof of that? And that is part of me today. My mom was an artist. Her family was from the same sort of part of South Central Ohio, although her dad, by the time she was born in Columbus, Ohio, so they were city people. They were hill people, and those people never had very much money. So both my parents, with the exception of my grandfather, who did have a lot of money before he died, because he was a businessman, and he was ruthless, and his question was, how are you going to make money to do that? My father didn't care about that, and my mother didn't care about it because she was an artist. And she used to say, do what you love, do something creative every day. I would get all crazy and bored and everything else, and she would say, do something creative, make something, draw something. And of course, I got myself a tape recorder, and that's the rest of the story. So her values were more along the lines of do what you like, do something creative every day. And she continued to paint and to teach art, and she painted and made things creatively up until she died at 99. And my mom did this stuff, well into her 80s. And my sister used to say, you should quit. You need to quit doing that, because she didn't think that her art was very good. But my mom didn't care. She just wanted to do the art. The other thing that she did brilliantly was she defended both of us like a tiger. My sister was in the hospital a lot. She's the toughest person I know, and she embodied my dad's values, and I kind of embodied my mom's values because they resonated with me a lot more. My sister, he used to tell us, you got to get an education. You gotta get your sheepskin. And I never listened to him. So I have a I have a high school education, and it shows. My sister has a very good education. She was a teacher, but she had a lot of orthopedic problems when she was a kid, so she was in the hospital a lot. And my mom, you didn't cross her. She would turn a hospital upside down. I remember they had a Chevette that was yellow, and they had a lot of problems with this Chevette. And my mom took it back to the dealership, and they said, we can't do anything. And my mom told them, I'm going to park that car out there with a sign on it that says lemon, and I'm going to call the TV stations. And they were like, we'll fix it. So she was not somebody you trifled with either. So they were both like that. And the story that I would tell you about her family is that my grandmother, there's a picture of my grandmother getting on her wedding day really a long time, probably 100 years ago or more. And she had a cloth coat and a homespun dress on. My grandfather on my mom's side was an adventurer and I would say a warrior. He was in 3 wars. And he went to the South Pacific to build the airstrips at Tinian because he was a Seabee as well, and a Master Chief in the Navy. And they ended up getting into a pitched battle with the Japanese because the Japanese allowed the Marines to think that the island had been pacified, and then when they left, they came out of the holes. And so my grandfather at 48 had some hand-to-hand combat, which was pretty intense, and I know it because I've read his diary. So that was pretty wild. He was an undercover cop. He worked at the prisons. He was protector of the governor and the county clerk and a bunch of other things that he did. So he was quite an interesting guy. And I love both of my grandfathers. My grandfather on my mom's side was warm and wonderful. And I think, my family on my dad's side is very argumentative. We yelled a lot. My dad would yell at my sister would yell at me, he'd yell at my mom would yell back. I know they loved each other, but my dad's family was so contentious, and my mom's family was more loving, but she learned to be contentious too, which again, an adoption of, let's say, a value later in life. So I told a bunch of stories. Those weren't the only stories I told. I told a bunch of stories. And the moral of the story, so to speak, is if you're listening to these stories, you kind of follow along and you think about your own family's values and principles. But the principles that we follow are probably drawn from experiences we might not even remember as a child. And as is the case with Grandpa Fierce, there are probably values that you don't want to adopt, but they're inculcated because you experienced them perhaps as a child. You heard these stories when you were a child, or you saw it happen when you were a child. It's hard to get those kinds of things out of your mind, and they become principles because of how you were raised. So I can identify with people that have families that may not have real good principles. Now, I'm not saying we didn't have good principles. I think my dad really was principled, and I think that really has stayed with me. The older I get, the more I think of my father, and I think of my mom too. But I they're both passed away. But I think of my father quite a lot. So I hope that people who are listening to the stories, not to comment or to say I didn't like that story, I did like that story, or whatever, but to think about your own values and your own families in retrospect. We don't talk about values and principles very much. We talk about values, I think, more than we talk about principles, and we confuse the two in just normal everyday speech. When you're talking to people and they say, this is what I think, they are operating from a value that they've adopted or adapted, or something they read, or something they heard. More often than not, it's something they've heard here on YouTube or in some podcast or something that they've read. So we often confuse a value with a principle. The best way for me to think about it would be to say that values are flexible. Principles are simply rules, and they are not flexible. So whatever principles you learned as a child, it takes some illumination, it takes some ventilation in the mind to fully take into account what principles it is or are that you learned that make you up as a person. And I'm not experienced enough in psychology to really fully understand that, or psychiatry, depending on what what your problem is. But I think it's very interesting when we think about national values. You hear all kinds of talk about national values and national principles. I find it difficult to talk about that because they're so flexible and there's so many, and they depend on your place in life and where you came from and where you've gone and what you've done. And this isn't a judgment about somebody else's values or somebody else's principles. This is a statement about how complex these things are and how they become fairly unconscious in our day-to-day activities. So I guess I'll end it there and just say I think this is a good podcast. I love telling stories about my family. They are very personal, and some of them are pretty intense. So it's kind of an intense and personal podcast, which kind of scares me a little bit when you put stuff out and people react to it. But again, if you don't tell somebody real stories, then they don't have anything to react to compare to. So I thought, well, I'm going to go ahead and do this. It's a far cry from what you as a viewer might have suggested in terms of what I'm supposed to talk about. I'm sure Jim Bridger had values and principles. It's hard to determine fully what they were. I'm certainly not a mountain man, and I certainly didn't have his experience in life. Bridger started as a riverboat guy back when they had just flat boats that they pushed with poles down the river, and in this case up the Missouri against the current, and then signed on early in life. He was about 20 to trap beaver, learned the trade, and never came back from the West. He stayed out west, and he loved being out west, and at the end of his life he lost his eyesight. And he said, boy, I wish I could see just once. I could go back out to Montana or Wyoming and stand at the top of the mountain and see. It was so you could see so far in those days. And he was great with kids and told great stories. And he was also gregarious, surprisingly, for the time amount that he spent out in the wilds. One might say that there aren't people like that anymore. And I kind of think it's probably true because they had a level of experience, the time that they grew up in, the place that they grew up in, the things that are connected to that time, and we all have that based on our birth. The year of our birth, we carry things with us and memories with us that younger people and people in different and successive generations don't carry. So that's why our ancestors become so important to us. And this really isn't 23andMe so much as to think about what stories did your parents select to tell you about your grandfather? What stories did he select to tell his son, and so on? And how far back did they go? Now, my family came from Wales, probably in the early to mid 1840s and 50s, to be coal miners in south central Ohio. There were Cornish coal miners and iron miners up in northern Michigan, and of course later what we used to call bohunks in Minnesota, the Hungarians and Italians and Bohemians that came up to northern Minnesota to mine taconite. So they were immigrants. My mom's family came here, and the earliest evidence we have is that they were here in the 1760s, and we know this because we have an old family Bible and we know the names, so we have some work on that. She tried to do the family tree, but she never really finished it. She had this huge thing she drew a tree, and she had different people's names on it, but she tried to do some Ancestry.com stuff, but she never finished it. So anyway, that's about it. We are in the middle of another one of these windstorms, dust storms out here in Joshua Tree, and I have the wind keeps shifting, so you have to keep switching the vehicle around so that you're not nose into the wind and you're blocking the wind from the campsite. So I'm going to go do more of that. Also, it's extremely dusty, which means my throat gets super dry. So it's just got to drink some more water. In fact, I might just make myself some coffee. Thanks for watching. Thanks for checking out the podcast in the description box below. I'll put the links up. And I guess that's about it. I'm really enjoying camping on this dry lake bed. If you think I'm in the national park of Joshua Tree, I'm not. I will probably go camp there at some point, but I'm out on the dry lake bed. And if you've been here, you know what I'm talking about. It's really a cool place. I really like it here. I think I love the dry lake bed. Now, if it starts raining, you got to get out. But the services are much better than other places I've been because they're closer. It's like 11 minutes to the Walmart, and then there's a bunch of cool places in Joshua Tree if you want to hang out. But mostly I've just been hanging out up here and drinking coffee and making pho. I've learned to make pho on the campfire, which is really kind of cool. I'll tell you all about that at some point. And, that's what I'm doing. Just relaxing. 70 during the day, usually about 40 at night. I think I'm going to do a video about camping here, but I want to wait for a day that is not windy so you can get a sense of where I am. Anyway, I'm rambling. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Thanks for liking and sharing the Bob Davis Podcast at thebobdavispodcast.com, as well as here at Bob Davis Podcast YouTube channel. Bye-bye.